of us don't really pay attention to history, except if it's necessary. Many important events have happened, and several of us aren't aware of it. We tend to forget about the past and move on to the future when the past teaches us so much. The past teaches us about our previous mistakes and eventually lets us know not to commit those same mistakes again. We learn from those mistakes so we can do better. History itself is very significant to our lives in many ways, and every event is just as important as the other. Those events teach us about past lives and how great things came to be, as well as why we are the way we are. The Cuban Missile Crisis is one of those events. It was and continues to be very important to history, as it was one of the first encounters of a nuclear war between two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. I grew very interested in the Cuban Missile Crisis as I began to read articles and texts from books. I was fascinated by the cause and effect of this occurrence, and as I researched more and more, my fascination continued to grow. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened during the Cold War in October 1962 and was a major confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. The topic is very crucial and should be learned, if not already, by others. In this speech, I will be discussing the importance of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how two very important superpowers came close to nuclear war. Firstly, I will be discussing the events leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Afterwards, I will discuss the outcome and changes it made to our lives. Lastly, I will discuss the importance it made to history and its effects. I want to first start off by stating what the Cuban Missile Crisis is and how it began. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it initially started during the Cold War. It was ultimately very traumatic to those living during that time period. After World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union became world superpowers and were two of the only countries with nuclear wars. As stated in an article found online titled The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, by the site Office of the Historian, several missile sites were being built in Cuba by the Soviet Union. Now, you're probably wondering, why did this upset the United States? Well, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was an attempt to overthrow the Castro government that was currently in Cuba, but failed in 1961, Soviet leader Nikita placed nuclear missiles in Cuba to prevent any future invasions such as the one that had previously occurred. Photo evidence was shown to President Kennedy about the missile sites. This triggered the United States and made Kennedy feel that the country was being threatened by the current communist Cubans. Kennedy figured that Castro would attack the United States and kill civilians. Shortly after, Kennedy informed the public and issued a quarantine as stated in the article 40 years ago, The Cuban Missile Crisis, which can be found online in the website National Archives. You'd think the public would change their opinions towards Cuba, but to a large scale, the public did not. The public was already concerned about the spread of communism in the United States, so their opinions changed either a little or not at all. The public was already against the Castro government in Cuba both before and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, so when they were informed, the majority was in shock, which later turned into fear. Several people thought that the nuclear weapons were a real threat, so they therefore prepared for the worst as the days had been progressing. After the Bay of Pigs occurred, Cuba was greatly supported by the Soviet Union. The United States didn't invade or attack Cuba during this time, as they might have feared that the Soviets would respond by attacking them back. After discussing the events to the Cuban Missile Crisis, I will now be discussing how it ended and several of the outcomes. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended when the United States agreed to not disturb Cuba's territorial sovereignty. After 13 days of fear and panic, the Soviet leader finally agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba on October 28, 1962, as stated in the article Cuban Missile Crisis, found on the website titled John F. Kennedy, the Presidential Library and Museum. When the crisis began to dissolve, the citizens in the United States started to slowly lose the fear of communism spreading as it was contained after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis was very crucial and showed us a part of history that tends to be overlooked. Many countries started to become more cautious with the building of missiles and with their use as well. The Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was which prohibited the general testing of nuclear weapons, was passed in the following year. This treaty was set forth on August 5, 1963, which was several months after the Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred. The treaty was signed by representatives from the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, three great superpowers of the time. The Cuban Missile Crisis was very important and still continues to be. I would like to close this discussion by stating my conclusion. In this speech, I discussed and informed about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it originated. The crisis was and will never be forgotten, as it was a close confrontation to a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. It taught us about a significant part in history that is powerful. Ever since, fewer nuclear threats have occurred and more countries are more cautious. The Cuban Missile Crisis continues to be learned as it was very important in time. It was ultimately very tragic as it changed many lives and it will never be forgotten in time.